Hi everyone, welcome to the session today. My name is John Versace. I'm a Senior Financial Advisor here at Up12 Partners. Up12 Partners is a national financial advice group. We've got 60 employees and we've got a team dedicated to looking after Aussie expats. We've got Margot Andersen joining us today, who is a career management and leadership specialist with a specialty in assisting expats. So today's session is designed to help Aussie expats that are looking to return back to Australia navigate the financial and career challenges that they may have as they come back to Australia. We understand many of you may be doing it tough at the moment with lockdowns and not being able to come back to Australia. If you're in that boat, we really do sympathise with you, and we hope you can make it back as soon as you possibly can. So just a little bit of housekeeping. If you've got any questions through our session today, please feel free to ask the questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen there, and we'll answer those at the end of the session. If they're very specific questions, we may not be able to answer them in the session today, and we also, with the amount of questions, we'll try and get to as many of them as we possibly can. A lot of you have asked questions through the registration process as well, and we'll try and answer as many of those as we can. But if any questions we can't answer, we will try and answer via email in the coming days. The session is also being recorded, so we'll send a copy of the recording to you in the coming days through an email. So a little later on, I'm going to talk through the financial challenges as you relocate back to Australia. But firstly, please let me introduce my co-host today, Margot Andersen. So Margot is the founder of Insync Network Group, which is a community of Australians that have repatriated back from overseas. She's also the director of Talent Insight, which is a career management and leadership consultancy firm. Margot is the host of the very popular Boomeranging podcast, which interviews many successful Aussie expats as they've repatriated back to Australia. So very relevant to obviously all of you listening today, and it's worth definitely a listen to hear some other stories. Margot's helped many Aussie expats reintegrate into the Australian workforce after being overseas, and has got a lot of great tips to share with us today. So without further ado, over to you, Margot.
Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate the intro there. As John said, I'm the founder of a community called Insync Network Group. And Insync, I guess, was really born out of the work that I did in Talent Insight. And when I was chatting to people or chatting to organizations and there was an expat in the room, they'd find me and they'd say, oh my gosh, how did you go when you repatriated from overseas? My personal story is that I had 7 years in the UK. Like many Aussies, I went for what I thought would be 1 year and accidentally stayed. And whilst I went for a bit of a career break initially, what happened is I was presented with a phenomenal opportunity. So I stayed on the back of career. And my challenge was when I came back to Australia was actually re-entering the workforce and leveraging the experience that I had. And so when I talked about that, I found that there were a lot of people in a similar boat. So our community is fairly diverse. We've got people who've been away for 7 years or 5 years, right through to 30. We've got people who have come home single, people who've come home with families, and they have to face the challenge of reintegrating families. So what we realized is that we were a lot stronger together than we were just all running around separately. So hence the network was formed. And what came through that network is not just the need for building our professional ties, but also really looking at how we can educate ourselves on the market here in Australia, and also, I guess, re-enter the market here with some real confidence, and in a manner that doesn't set us back, but rather sort of positions us to go forward. The great thing about the Boomeranging podcast is it's given us an audience overseas. So we now are seeing a lot more people in our community who are currently sitting offshore and who are looking to engage with Aussies who are back here on the ground. So we're seeing a really nice new level of interaction that's starting to take place. So one of the things that I do want to talk to really is around the career element for today. So if we could just go forward on the next slide. Oh, actually, before we do that, what I'd really love to do is just get a little bit of an idea of who we've got on the call and your situation. I know many of you are still currently overseas, but we have a couple of questions here. The first one being, what stage of your career are you at? We'd just love to get a gauge on where people are sitting there. So if you could just take a moment to quickly fill in that'd be great. So, yep. Okay. Hopefully you can also see the results that are coming through. So the bulk of people are currently sitting midway in their career. A couple of pre-retiree, couple who are in early retirement. Okay, great. Thank you. Next question is are you, for those of you who are returning home with, are you coming with a job lined up, or you're still not sure at the moment? You're simply gathering information? No? Okay, yep. Okay, great. Wonderful. Okay, so the bulk are returning home without a role. Thank you for that. Last one is what's your biggest concern about your transition back to Australia? And you can fill in multiple questions here. Be just keen to sort of understand that. This will help us sort of tailor, I guess, some of the content through the presentation. Reconnecting uncertainty of the market. Yep. Okay, finding a good culture and fit role back home. Excellent. Okay, yeah, so market knowledge is going to be really key. Excellent. Okay, great. Thank you for that. So, yep. Okay, so we can move on to the next one. I guess just a little bit of background on what's been going on with the expats who did return in 2020. Now, for those of you who know of the group Advance, they do a lot of research and work with Aussies who are currently overseas. They had a look at the 400,000, or what was at the time 400,000 people returning, and went, where are people? What are they doing? And we know that 33% landed a job when they got back. 19% are looking for a role. There's a couple of statistics here that are really important, I think. 19% of 400,000, I guess, equates to about 76,000 people that are looking for a new role that have come back. People building their own business, about 15%. In the work that I do, one of the things that I hear is a lot of people start their own business because they're having difficulty navigating the market. So that's a really interesting statistic. I think the other really interesting one is for those people who've come back with a role, about 10%, that was about 40,000, I guess. We know that typically, whilst people are happy to return with a role, if they're not in a position to leverage their experience, their tenure with the organisation becomes fairly short-lived. So we know that about 30% of people move on from their company within the first 12 to 18 months of being home. So when we look at this pie graph, I guess, there's a lot of people who are really consciously exploring the market at the moment. Now what's happened is we've actually, since this survey has been run, those numbers of Australians that have come home have increased from 400,000 to 600,000. So we've got a lot of returned expats in the market seeking to navigate that. And I think one of the key messages here is that whilst we've all had fantastic experience overseas, we really need to know how to articulate that experience with real confidence and relevance to the market here. So the market knowledge piece is going to be really, really critical. Moving on. One of the other stats that Advance did is that they had a look at really what are the struggles that people encounter when they come back. 85% of those that return without a role have found it really difficult to find work. And that has been around understanding the timeframes that might take. 67% have considered going back overseas because they haven't been able to find the right opportunity here in the market. 70% really struggle with the impact that has on our own level of confidence as we go to market. I think this one is a really big one. 83% of recruiters are really cautious about recommending people who've had extended periods overseas. 45% think that returned expats expect too high a salary and that they're out of step in the market. And I think that what I want to do is share these statistics, certainly not as a fear or to frighten people away, but to really reinforce the message that I think having a plan is really critical. And the earlier that you can start that plan, the better you are to navigate and overcome some of these challenges. And it's that whole adage that if we're aware of a problem, we can seek to solve it. So I think it's really about understanding what is it that I can be doing today whilst I'm offshore, if you're still offshore, to help soften that landing. And if you're in that sort of first 3 to 6 months of being back, where should I actually start first? What are some of the strategies that I should look at? We know that the first 3 months when you're back home typically is taken up with the logistics of organising life, unpacking boxes, finding a house, all those sorts of things. But once all of those things are sorted, the kids are in school, all those things, once those things are sorted and you come up for air, it's like, oh my gosh, where do I start? So there's a number of areas that I'd really like to encourage you to think about today. Okay. One of the things I would say is we are seeing some sparks of light most recently. We've started to hear that there are some really big appointments that have come through the CEO landscape. Most recently, we've heard about Australian Opera, MCA have appointed, career expats into positions. For those of you who know the podcast, there's some couple of stories on there of a guy called Andy Whitford who returned after a long period of time overseas, came back with a CEO role. But we are also starting to see it not just at the top, but sort of starting to filter through. There are certain markets that certainly have a greater appetite for embracing the expat experience. That is markets such as the tech startup, and especially tech finance. We're seeing banking, having a bit of a surge and being really open, especially around governance and risk. We're seeing marketing and advertising really kind of being caught short on the skills shortage. We've had so many people here internationally filling some of those roles. So we're starting to see some real movement with the expat talent landing in some of those roles. So I think, though, again, it goes to how do we know the market? So some of the tips that I really want to share today are around, firstly, I think making sure that we have a real line of sight or real clarity around what it is that we're looking to do. If we can move on to, the next slide. So actually, sorry, before we get into that, one of the things I want to talk about is how this actually fits in, I guess, the whole of the repatriation life cycle. So one of the things I talk about there are 6 zones that we really need to navigate if we're going to land well. So we have to work out how we're going to arrive well, how we're going to work well, and how we're going to live well. And when I talk about arriving well, we've got to get the logistics right. We've got to get ourselves home. We've got to get pets home. We've got to get our furniture home. We've got to find a house. We've got to physically set our life up. Financially, we have to be really careful about how we move money and assets, pensions, etc. And that's where John's area of expertise comes in. The area of work well is really around the professional aspects. So we need to think about career. What is it that we're actually going to do or we want to do? But we also need to think about the business culture here and how do we actually fit into that, especially if we've been away for a long period of time. We also need to think about the well-being aspects here. So socially and emotionally, how are we going to land? And one of the things that I often hear about is how that piece really catches people by surprise. We've often had these incredibly stimulating, rich experiences in other cultures and ways of life. And coming back, it can feel like that word back is actually prominent. We're coming back into something rather than continuing to move forward. So thinking about our families, our friends, what it is that we like to do in our downtime, we need to think about all those things. So today, John's obviously going to talk about the arrive well piece and the financial piece, and I'm going to talk about the professional piece. So the key elements to really making sure that we land well here is having some career clarity. And for many of us, we need to really consciously stop and think, what is it that I can do? What are the knowledge and skills that I bring to the table? We also need to think about, it's great, but what will I do? So I have these knowledge and skills, but do I want to do those things? Am I looking to do a like for like role? For many people, when they return to Australia, they're like, I've had the big role. I don't need to have another big role again, or as big a role, or I know that I'm going to have to take a sideways step, or I might have to go back one level to go forward one level. Well, you need to be really clear about what the boundaries are around those things. The other thing that I would suggest you really think about is, where do I best fit? And often we talk about the culture of an organization or the style of leadership that we're really looking at. But I'd also really encourage you to think about, what life cycle of the business do I think I best fit? Done a lot of work with people that have been in really big transformational roles offshore. And when they come back, it's like, hang on a minute, where do I find a role on that scale here in Australia? The reality is that the market here is small. It's much, much smaller than where most people have been sitting. So the challenge is how do I step back into a smaller market but keep my career moving forward? And often what it is we're not looking at like for like transition in terms of types of organizations, but we might need to look at the stage that the organization is in. So if we're looking at organizations that are going through mergers and acquisitions, or we're looking at organizations that are going on huge growth trajectories, okay, it might be in a different market, or it might be at certainly a different sort of size of organization, but the stage that the organization is similar. So I've recently worked with two people who've come back, and one was sort of in a very big supply chain role, and another one was in a whole of business role. Both of them have now landed in private business in Australia, but with one with a very big transformational agenda, and another one with a really rapid growth agenda through Asia. So they've been able to leverage their experience, knowledge, networks, albeit in a different style and shape of a business. So think about the stage of the business life cycle. The next piece here, which we'll really talk to, I guess, around knowing the demand. Where does the demand fit? So we really need market intel. And that's one of the things that I find that most expats are actively seeking out of something like an Insync, or in terms of reconnecting with their network. We need to know and understand what are the drivers of the market here, or the company and the organization that we're about to engage with. We need to be really clear about the size and the complexity. And we need to be really clear about our own salary expectations, because we can't tailor our positioning or our story if we don't know what we're tailoring it to. So for many people, they come back and they start to tell their story, and they realize that it's not landing or not connecting, because people are not able to go, oh, I see how that fits here. What happens is those typical objections start to come up of like, oh, we don't have anything that big here. You'll be bored in a few months' time. And so what happens is we actually feed the assumptions that people are making, and we move ourselves further out of the game park or the interview process, etc. So we really need to know and understand our market. And this is where I would suggest that your networks become really, really important. So we need to understand who we have in our world. And I always suggest mapping your networks, because that way you can then understand how you can go to your networks. So it's just super critical. I think once we know what we want to do, we know what we can do. I think once we know a little bit about the market, we can start to localize our global story. We can start to work on our own positioning. So we can start to say, look, I understand some of the challenges that you are having here. Let me share with you my background and where I've worked and what I've done. One thing that I would talk to about roles and companies that you've worked in, be really careful if you've worked in a brand that doesn't exist in Australia, because you actually have to help people here understand what is that equivalent to. So for example, if you've been working in Tesco's in the UK, now for those of who've lived in an expat world, most of us have come across Tesco's, but for people who haven't, it's about saying, look, I've worked in a brand similar to a Woolworths in the Australian market. And the problems that we had to solve when I was working in this role at Tesco's was boom, boom, and boom. So rather than talking to the size and scale, because we know that it's a different level offshore, we can talk to the challenges and the problems faced, because they are universal. Whether or not they're a different sort of size is irrelevant. It's about being able to talk to the heart of what the problem is. I think the other thing is be very careful about role titles, because there are certain role titles that will actually frighten people away. If you start talking about being the VP of XYZ, we don't typically carry vice president roles in Australia. So to be able to say, look, I've really worked at the equivalent of an executive director for marketing or for whatever. So localize the role titles that you've had. And again, that will come through conversations and understanding what the market appreciates here. What are the drivers? What is it that is commonly used? How do I tailor my story? One of the biggest challenges that people talk to me about is saying, Margot, I feel like I've got to dumb down my experience. And I'm like, please don't do that. That is not what it's not helping you, it's not serving you, and it's certainly not serving anyone on the other side of the table looking to interview you. I think what you've got to do is help contextualize it. And so give people anchors that they can understand and that they can hold on to. As I said before, one of the key things you really have to do is map your network. And for many people, this can feel a little bit hard and clunky, because you kind of go, well, hang on a minute, my network is a bit tired and they won't remember me, they don't know me. And so it's about, how do I re-engage with authenticity and with purpose, so that I don't feel disingenuous in that process. And being really transparent about, look, it's been a while since we worked together. It was, 15 years ago. I'm really interested in what you've done, and I'd love to share with you what I've done. Because what you need to understand is, what do I know versus what do I need to know? And your network your tired networks may not be the ones that will get you the job, but they'll certainly help you educate you on the market. They'll help bring you up to speed with what's happening here. What have been the challenges in the business landscape or the industry versus what is it in the specific career path? What do they need to know about me? Because the danger is they'll remember you for where you were, not where you are today. So there might be a bit of education that you need to do. Have a think about your networks that are sitting offshore, who might also have ties back into Australia, because they'll have a fresh knowledge of where you are and what you do. And what do you want from your network? Do you need to be educated? Do you need to be connected? Do you need to be informed? What is the purpose of engaging? Finally, I would suggest to you that I think that you really need to take a staged approach. So there are some people who come back and think, okay, well, I can work here and I'd love to get a board role and I'd love to be on this sort of, part of this industry group. I think one of the things you've got to think about is, what is the number one priority, and how do I build on that? Again, for those of you who know the podcast, there was a great one by a woman called Jan McGrath, returned after 19 years overseas, huge global roles, came back with MasterCard, came back with a role. It didn't quite work out. So she started to navigate the market. She's recently just landed board positions that take her back into Asia. So now it's finally, after a few years home, that she said, look, I've laid the foundations for my career, but I'm now leveraging my international experience. And that's where I feel like I'm winning. So sometimes it doesn't all come together in the first hit. It does take a staged approach. Finally, again, contribute from afar. If you're sitting offshore, think about, how can I be contributing to my industry? What is it that I can give or do? Again, I know I keep coming back to the podcast, but I'm trying to just provide you anchors also for stories of people who may share similar challenges to you. But there's a fellow called Shane Masters who took 3 attempts to come home and land the gig. And he said, it wasn't until I realized that I could actually contribute from where I was that I started to really build out my network. And ultimately, it helped me come back with the role. So I sort of said to my network, look, I'm not coming home tomorrow. I might be here another year or 2, but what can I do for you? Do you want networks in the US? Does your industry need them? Does your organization need them? I'm happy to share them. I can act as a conduit for you. He started to produce content that he could be shared in industry magazines. He spoke at events for industry and shared his intel. So think about what are ways that you can contribute from where you are today. It will position you with real strength when you land, and it will build your network as you go with meaning and purpose. In essence, I always say that repatriation is about reconnection. It is about people and places and ways of life and ways of doing business. So hence the fact that it really is that whole wheel. We can't come back and just land a gig and then have half the family being really unhappy. Because if we do, okay, we're not going to get the fulfillment or the joy that we hope for when we return. So we really need to think about it holistically. I appreciate that career and finance are probably 2 of the big anchors that we need to focus on, but please do keep it in the context that it is a whole piece that, we don't just move our heads, we move our whole bodies, our whole families home. So think about how we can set that up holistically as well. I know that it's very quick, but are there any questions around the career aspects that people might have or things they want to know more about? Because we can put that in some follow-up information. If you want to just type your questions into the Q&A, that would be great. We can also circle back at the end. No? All right, I'm going to introduce John now. I know that John gave a little bit of background about Apt Wealth before, but what I do want to sort of say is that he's a senior financial advisor with Apt Wealth Partners. He's been in the game with them for 10 years. Really informed. And I first met John through the Insync community when I started to have a cohort of people that were like, Margot, it's great to connect, but I actually need some really specialist advice. So I was like, that's certainly not me. I appreciate the importance of it, but I need to go and build some strategic partnerships with people such as John. So hence I met him through that process, and he's been a great support to our community and providing really tailored advice. So I think without further ado, I'm going to let him speak a little bit more about that. So
thanks for that, Margot, and thanks for a great presentation. There was some great insights there. So much like Margot's tips, it is important to have a strategy on the financial planning side when you're looking to repatriate to Australia. No doubt that navigating finances as an expat is really complex. With the ever-changing tax laws and navigating things like foreign currency. It is really tricky. Don't neglect it. Make sure you've got a strategy. Firstly, we'll just go through, just to explain that this is general information. I've got to give this disclaimer. Please don't rely on this as personal information. If you're looking for personal information, please come and seek out personal advice from a professional. So we'll go through these topics today, but just moving on, we'll onto the first slide. Actually, sorry, we'll go through initial questions. So we'll do a poll, and we're just keen to see exactly what your biggest concern financially is in coming back to Australia. So there's various options there. You can choose more than one. But if you just choose what are the big concerns you have in coming back to Australia. So the very common tax issues are coming out on top, which is to be expected. Foreign pensions, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So just about 5 more seconds, we might give this poll. So tax is a big one, and we'll talk around some of the tax considerations through the session. So thank you for providing those responses. So the first thing I'll say is it is really important to enjoy your journey overseas and enjoy your experience overseas. You may never get this experience again, and I think life is about enjoying experiences. Make sure that you come home if possible without any regrets. Do all the things that you'd set out to achieve when you originally set off to go overseas. And if it does mean using some more financial resources to achieve those goals, that's okay. That's completely fine to do that. But it's also about making sure that you've got the future looked after as well, and your future goals. So sometimes it is a bit of a delicate balancing act, but make sure that you enjoy the now and your experience overseas, but also have an eye for the future. So the next point is to start the planning process as early as you possibly can. Now, I can't stress this enough. Make sure that you don't leave it to the last minute wherever possible. The best repatriation processes financially start years in advance, if possible. That way you can really navigate some of the tax and currency exchange issues and other financial issues that you need to navigate, and navigate them as effectively as possible. The more time you have, the better it will be. The other point as well is try and set up a time frame for returning. And I completely realise this isn't always possible, and many of my clients do not have the ability to set a time frame because of work assignments. You're not sure when that's going to end, or various other factors. Some people don't know if they actually want to return to Australia yet or not. So, but where possible, if you can set a time frame, that will make it much easier for you to actually plan, the financial repatriation journey, and set up, a really cohesive, effective plan in motion. So where to build assets and whilst you're overseas, whether you build them overseas or whether you build them in Australia. And this is a really key consideration. And ultimately, so it's probably more so a consideration for those that are, a couple of years out from relocating back to Australia. But ultimately, it's going to determine how easy, financially it's going to be for you to return. So it is important to sort of think of these things well in advance. A couple of key things to think about in making a decision here. The first one is, for what purpose are you building your assets? So usually we're building assets, for some sort of future goal, whether it might be for funding a retirement, or if it's for, building up a deposit for a family home. There's usually a specific goal we have in mind for building assets. If not, then it's important to think about those things. And where those goals are going to take place, whether it be overseas or in Australia, should be, I guess, a big consideration in where you're building your assets. And that feeds into the next point on your slide there, which is considering currency exchange risk. So this is a really important point. We'll talk a lot about it a little bit later in the session, but it's really important to consider currency exchange risk. And I'll put it in the context of an Aussie expat that's living in the US, building all their retirement assets in the US, but going to fund a retirement in Australia. What they would be doing there is essentially, if they're moving back to Australia and have all their assets in the US, they'll have to constantly pull assets from the US to Australia to fund their retirement living needs. And on top of the asset market ups and downs, they'll also have to deal with the currency market ups and downs as well. And that can add some risk around your situation. So it's really important to consider the currency in where you build your assets. The next point on your slide there is considering taxes both in Australia and overseas. Now, I know this was a huge concern for most of you in that poll there, and it's no surprise. We're not going to be able to cover all aspects of taxes for an Aussie expat, because we could do a whole session alone on that and probably not cover everything. But it is really important to look at what the tax scenario looks like in the country that you're residing right now, and what it will look like when you come back to Australia. So I guess just to give an example, so let's consider an Aussie expat that's living overseas at the moment, but looking to build assets in Australia. What assets you build, what asset class can have a really drastic impact on what eventual capital gains you'll pay. So, looking at the two most popular asset classes for an Aussie expat, firstly looking at property. So for an Aussie expat that's a non-resident for Australian taxes, buying a property, the eventual capital gains that you'll pay on eventual sale will be between 32.5% and 45% as a non-resident. And that's because you don't get the 50% discount on capital gains on property. Looking at the alternative, or one of the alternatives, which is shares as a non-resident for Australian taxes. Essentially, if you've bought those shares whilst you're overseas, for Australian tax purposes, you won't pay taxes, capital gains taxes, for the period of time that you're a non-resident on any gains, typically on the shares that you've accumulated. So you can see very, very different capital gains implications. Now, of course, you need to consider what the tax implications are overseas. You'll typically be assessed on your worldwide assets. So there's no sort of definite answer here, because you're all in different destinations and different circumstances. But considering what the implications will be overseas and what they will be in Australia is really important. I know we've got a lot of people tuning in from the US. So just consider from a US tax perspective, that example I gave about shares, ETFs and managed funds can be problematic if you buy them in Australia. So we often work with clients in working out what assets they can build using with US tax liabilities, because they can be really, really complex, as I'm sure those in the US are aware. So just moving on to the next slide. So the next thing to think about is just what your life is going to look like and what goals you have when you come back to Australia. And this will give you really some good clarity on I guess what financial decisions you need to make as you come back to Australia, because sometimes it can be confusing, but this will help you, give you clarity. The first thing I guess most people would think about is housing. So many of you will be thinking, of coming back to Australia and buying a property. Unfortunately, as I'm sure you're aware, that's been increasing very rapidly in Australia. But considering what deposit you're going to need to buy a property is really important. And if you're going to be moving into an existing property or renting, they're all going to have very different financial implications that you need to factor into your planning. If you've got to buy a car when you come back to Australia, that's really important. If you've got kids going to private school, or if you're going through extra education yourself, what's that going to cost? That can be quite expensive. The cost of living is really important to factor in and consider as part of your relocation strategy and goals. If you're coming from a destination like New York or Hong Kong that are relatively expensive, it may be quite easy for you to come back to Australia because you'll be in more expensive or as expensive cities as some of the major Australian cities. But if you're coming from a relatively inexpensive city, then to fund your cost of living, there's going to be an adjustment process that you need to go through and factor into your planning, because Australia, by world standards, is relatively expensive. As Margot mentioned in her presentation, thinking about the family goals and it's not all about finances and career. It's about making sure that your family is looked after, and some of that will require financial planning and considering what's required to achieve your family goals. Wages is really important. So some of you may have come from roles that are you're well remunerated overseas, but may not be replicated in Australia. And it is important, as Margot mentioned, to look at the market and see what your expectations will be in Australia. How does that then correlate into achieving your broader financial goals in Australia. Then retirement, you're going to be funding, if you're coming back to retire, is it retirement going to be funded from resources in Australia or overseas? How much are you going to need? By the way, you might see some figures on what you need for retirement. It is highly dependent on your personal circumstances and what your personal retirement goals will be. We usually work with individuals and I'm working out what specifically you need, but how you then fund that is going to be really important. So, thinking through all of these considerations, plus, obviously many more in terms of your financial future and what you want to achieve when you come back to Australia, will give you, a lot of clarity then on what the next decisions are on managing your finances. So just moving on to the next slide. So determining whether to keep your assets overseas or bring them back home. All of this really should be looked through the lenses of that previous slide we went through, and what your future goals are, and really thinking about what is the best financial strategy, utilizing all my assets and all my financial resources to put myself in the best possible position to achieve my longer term goals. So thinking about, if you're thinking of keeping the assets overseas, thinking about whether it achieves the purposes that you would, for your future goals and puts you in the best position. It may well do, if you can't replicate that asset in Australia, or if there's tax consideration around keeping the asset overseas, that's a big consideration. But you've got to think through the logistics as well of keeping assets overseas. And using the example of having a property overseas, you're likely to need to continue filing a tax return overseas, because often if you've got a property overseas, it will still be taxable in the country that you're coming from. It depends on where you are, of course, but that's often a consideration. And just thinking through the logistics of working with tenants and any repairs or property agents as you're back in Australia is a really important thing. So if you've got share accounts, sometimes just making sure that the brokerage house can still look after you when you're out of the country that they're domiciled. Sometimes they won't be willing to. So just making sure that your financial resources that are overseas are still going to be well looked after when you're back in Australia. If you're looking at bringing assets back to Australia, timing is absolutely critical on when you look to realise those assets and bring them back on a few fronts. But firstly, looking at the tax side of things, and I'm going to get into the Australian tax side of things in a moment, but whether you sell before you leave your foreign country that you're living in at the moment, or whether you sell when you're back in Australia, is going to be highly dependent on what the asset is, where you're currently located, what the tax system looks like overseas, and what the tax implications will be in Australia. And this will be highly dependent on circumstances. There's no one answer I can give you today, but make sure you do your homework. I'll give you an example. Recently, we had a client that was on an E3 visa in the US. They had about $200,000 of capital gains that they had in their US investment portfolio. We're looking to sell with, advice from their accountant and ourselves. We got them to hold off. They came back to Australia, sold, and basically instead of paying, potentially $30,000 of capital gains in the US, it was zero in Australia. And the reasons for that will be apparent in the next slide. Now, that's not advice for you guys because it will be very different depending on circumstances. But as you can see, timing can be really, really critical on when you realise assets and when you bring them home. So going on to the next slide, which feeds into this point, which is tax residency. So many of you will have seen that there's potential legislation changes which are being proposed. I'm not going to go through those today because they're just proposals at this point. It's not legislation, but as it currently sits, tax residency, for many of you that are non-resident at the moment, but looking to come back to Australia and move back permanently, the day that you become you land on the tarmac in Australia is typically when you will then be seen as a tax resident for Australia again. And what that then means is that your overseas assets will typically become assessable again for Australian capital gains tax on the day that you return. The gains on your overseas assets from that day forward would be assessable typically in most circumstances for Australian taxes. There may be certain situations where it would be the whole gains that you've made, but usually it's from the day that you come back and the gains going forward. An important thing to do is if you are keeping assets overseas, like property, get a valuation on the day that you leave or very close to it. That way you can, on eventual sale down the track, you can show your Australian accountant and make sure that they're, understanding exactly and it's really clear what will be assessable for Australian tax purposes. Medicare levy surcharge is really important as well. So if you're earning over 90,000 as a single or over $180,000 as a couple, if you don't have appropriate private hospital cover, then there is an extra surcharge that you'll have to pay, and that commences when you return. So getting that sorted as soon as possible is important. It's up to 1.5% that you can pay as an extra tax without having that appropriate cover. Overseas insurance is unlikely to be accepted as appropriate cover. It's got to be a registered Australian private hospital cover. So just have a look at that if you've as you're coming back to Australia. The other point as well, just on tax residency. So again, we've got a lot of people joining from the US. The US is one of the few countries in the world, actually one of two, that as a citizen or a green card holder, you'll be assessable even when you relocate overseas or move out of the US. So if you're bringing a US partner or if you've obtained US citizenship or a green card, you'll continue to need to file US taxes. Now, there's a double tax agreement between Australia and the US, but there's certain tax treatment on the US tax side on certain assets in Australia you've got to be very, very careful with, and how you build assets in Australia is really, really important to navigate. Some really common strategies are not great on the US tax side of things. I've written many blogs on this, so please refer to our website or get in touch if you've got any questions on that. So just moving on to the next slide. So foreign pensions, this is a really, really complex area. And as Margot mentioned, it's and in our initial poll, it's a common one we see from Aussies coming back to Australia of what to do with your foreign pension. It's a complex area, and I guess the big things to consider is how what the tax implications are of moving your foreign pension. So firstly, the first thing to consider is just how the ATO are going to look at your foreign retirement fund. So not all foreign retirement funds will be seen as what they call a foreign super fund by the ATO. So the key determining factor on that is if you can pull assets out of your retirement funds overseas before retirement age, it's unlikely the ATO are going to view it as a foreign super fund. It's likely to be seen as a foreign trust. So if it's seen as a foreign trust, then when you're in the Australian tax system, pulling assets out of the foreign super fund, the foreign pension scheme, is likely to be seen as taxable on your Australian tax return. If it's seen as a foreign super fund and you're considering moving it to Australian superannuation, you've got to, well, you don't have to, but there can be some advantages in acting quickly and moving the foreign super fund within 6 months of your return to Australia. it's a really, this is all a really complex area. Definitely get some advice, an accountant, financial advisor that understands this space. There's a lot of variables to work through, including, if you're moving to superannuation, there's some contribution limits you need to be mindful of. So just moving on to the next slide. Same token, employee shares, really complex, depends on circumstances, but there may be some things that you need to do or should do before you leave overseas to potentially manage the tax implications. If you've got options or rights from employee shares, there might be some things that you need to do, again, depending on circumstances, to minimise taxes and definitely get some accounting assistance there and some financial advice. But going through to the next point around currency exchange movement. So as we alluded to earlier, really critical space to look at, and sometimes it's often neglected by expats. But I guess the big thing that we see is, and the big risk is when you try and either you don't think about currency exchange risk, or you try and predict what the future movement's going to be, especially in the short term. And on your screen there, don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of these and bore you all, but it's there's a lot of factors that will influence the foreign exchange market and the prevailing exchange rate at any particular point in time. And it's so hard to predict, and really all of these factors mesh together to give you the exchange rate at any particular point in time. So it can be very volatile. So just on the next slide, we've got an example of this. This is the US dollar versus the Australian dollar going back 15 years. And you'll see, a lot of fluctuation. We've had times when it was $1.10 Australian against $1 US, and it went down to 60 cents, through COVID. Very volatile over time. Very difficult. And if you're thinking of, the point we were talking about earlier about having overseas assets in foreign currency, but Australian goals, this is really what's happening to your, your assets in an Australian dollar sense, on top of the asset market ups and downs. So it's a really important to think about this because it will impact your ability to achieve your future goals. What we see many expats do is slowly bring assets back over a period of time. And that way you kind of get the average over time. What the best approach is for you is going to be, dependent on your circumstances, but thinking through the foreign exchange is really important. So the next point in relation to foreign exchange is just, and I think most of you are aware of this, but I'll just point it out, that make sure you shop around for providers. Don't just settle with the banking institution that you're with. There can be 3-4% differences in exchange rates between foreign exchange providers at one particular point in time, sometimes more. If it's a large amount of capital that you're moving, it can make a massive difference, tens of thousands sometimes, depending on who you use. So shop around and do your homework. And then, just looking at the cost of the move itself. Moving expensive items, moving pets can be really expensive. Moving yourselves is really expensive at the moment, unfortunately, with airline tickets. What's it going to cost for you to actually move yourself and your belongings back to Australia? Factor that into your planning. Try and, because sometimes it does get forgotten in the process. And if you can set aside some funds, that's great to just avoid dipping into credit cards and personal loans where possible. And just lastly, just wanting to go through a little bit about App 12 partners. So as I mentioned, we've got about 60 staff across Australia. We look after over $2.5 billion on behalf of our clients in investment funds that we manage. We've been around since the late 1980s, and we are a privately owned firm, so we're not part of a bank or institution. We don't own any products. Below, you'll see some of the awards that we've won recently, which has been fantastic. Recently, we've been nominated as Innovator of the Year for our expat work as well, which has been fantastic as well. So, it is a large firm, which is able to look after you as an expat, but also, we've got a lot of advisors that can look after you after your expat journey as well. So we've got you covered through your full life journey. Here's the services. So the big thing we really look at is what your financial situation looks like now, what your future goals are, and then putting together a step-by-step guide to put you in the best position to achieve your longer-term goals, factoring in all of those issues that we've discussed today as an expat. And then on an ongoing basis, we're there to provide ongoing support to help navigate your financial strategy as life and the financial world changes. It's important not to have a set and forget approach with any strategy, and we've got a team of analysts that help us put together investment portfolios for our clients. We do have a lot of professionals that we do deal with in various areas. So the accounting and legal space, we don't do in-house, but we've got some great professionals that we can bring in that are specialised in the expat space as well. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to go through. So moving on to some questions. Feel free to type those into the Q&A box at the bottom there. But we did get some pre-questions. Firstly, we did get a few questions on QROPs. So those moving from the UK. So the big thing there with QROPs is it used to be much easier to move your UK pension to Australia. In recent years, that's become much harder because of the determination on the UK side of things. So essentially, over 55 is the age that you would be able to start looking at this. Before the age of 55, unfortunately, the Australian superannuation system doesn't comply with the UK regulations. After the age of 55, there's very, very limited options. It's either there's a couple of funds that comply with the UK pension requirements and meet a QROPS compliant fund, or you need to set up a self-managed superannuation fund. And then, as I mentioned, once you've met those steps, you can potentially look at shifting into an Australian super fund, but there's some issues there that you've got to navigate and work through some of the tax considerations there as well. So very complex area. And then I'm just reading through some of the other considerations. 401k. So we've got a question in relation to 401k. There's been some private tax rulings that, as I mentioned, if you can pull the money out of a foreign pension before retirement age, it typically won't be seen as a foreign super fund from the Australian tax side of things. So 401ks, if you pull them out, even you can actually pull those out before retirement age, even with a tax penalty. So the ATO, won't see that typically as a foreign super fund. If you're in the Australian tax system, it may well be taxable on assessable income. Any other questions? Just coming to the end of the session now, and but just seeing if there's any other questions that might anyone else might have for Margot or myself. Might give it just a few more moments. Might be, yeah. Excellent. I think that's all great. So there was quite a few questions that we didn't get through in the registration process, but we will try and answer those via email in the coming days for you. But if there weren't any more questions for us today, we might wrap up. Actually, there's one coming through from Michael.
Yeah.
Okay.
The expats returning home with a job left within 12 to 18 months. Yeah, it's really interesting. So global mobility reports is put out by the organisations, or actually where they've been put out have been by a lot of the removalists who've done a scan on the environment, so the crowns of the world, if you like. And they have found that in the first 12 months, it was sat somewhere between 18 and 22%. And up to 18 months to 2 years, it jumped up to about 30%. And I think that the challenges that people typically face is that they come back into a smaller market. They might transfer with their organisation on a like-for-like role, but they realise that stepping back into a smaller market brings its own set of challenges. And so if the organisation hasn't had a plan to help, I guess, extrapolate or extract that information and embed it in the organisation where they are, you can feel like it's a bit overlooked. So people will often say to me, I've come back with a job. I'm super grateful with the job. I've got a like-for-like role, but actually it's a third of the remit in terms of the region. It's a third of the decision-making. It's a third of the ownership, and I'm missing the challenge. And so if there's not an opportunity to progress and jump up to the next level within the organisation, people will typically bound out. And sometimes people find it easier or think it can be easier to bound out rather than trying to navigate the complexities internally in the organisation. So it can be a difference in culture and a way of doing business. You transfer with, an organisation, like in the case of Jan McGrath, who shared on her podcast, I was in with MasterCard in the US and I transferred back to MasterCard in Australia. And I realised that the working culture and nuances of the organisation was just so different. I'd underestimated that. And so she felt that in order to looking for a new challenge in a different environment was what she needed to do. Now, she interestingly landed in a fintech startup, which after coming out of organisations like HSBC, MasterCard, all these different sorts of brands, American Express, she landed in a very different environment, but different stimulation, different challenge. So I think it's around really making sure, and I work with a lot of organisations around mapping retention of expats. If you are transferring with an organisation, I would say start having your conversations really early about how you're going to share your knowledge and leverage the knowledge that you have. Because otherwise what happens is you get back here and they say, okay, well, that those days are gone. Now you just need to focus on this. And you can kind of go, hang on a minute, I've just had the most incredible, fulfilling, stimulating career path. I'd like to think it's going to still going to build on that and go forward. So look at where those building blocks are with the organisation that you're coming back. There's a lot of advantages to coming back with an organisation, so I don't want to be dismissive of the opportunity of coming back. What I am saying is have the right conversations to set you up for that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we might wrap up, but thank you all for joining us, and hopefully you got something from the session today. You've got our details on the screen there, so you're most welcome to reach out for a chat around your personal circumstances with either Margot or myself. Thank you, Margot. It was great to have you today on the call, and have a great day or evening wherever you may be in the world, and thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, just before you go, one thing I would say is John is a prolific writer on content. So it's really well worth checking out some of his content because it will pertain to some of this stuff. And we've got some resources as well on our site. So if you're just looking for general information, head to the websites because there's plenty of information to be shared there. So
no, good point. Excellent. Absolutely. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone. And best of luck in your relocation.
Yeah, cheers.
Thank you. Bye.